I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm Marjorie Turner. I'm Senior Vice President for Program Planning and Management here at the Urban Institute, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today as we discuss disaster response and resilience in light of the recent hurricanes that have battered Texas and Florida. It's really fantastic to welcome everybody both to the room today and also online through our live stream. We'll be taking questions and expanding the discussion later in the program. And for those of you who are joining by live stream, you can submit questions to events@urban.org. And I also want to encourage everybody to expand this conversation beyond the room and beyond the live stream by sharing reactions, thoughts, observations on social media. And for that, if you would use the hashtag #AliveAtUrban, which is up on the screen, that would be terrific. So today's discussion will focus on how public policies can support both human and physical resilience through disaster relief and recovery. And it's obviously a really important and timely conversation for us to be having here at the Urban Institute as we and others in the room prepare to monitor and assess federal policy and funding in the wake of Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. The Urban Institute has over the years contributed to knowledge building around our experience in this work, particularly around the experience from Katrina and Sandy recovery efforts, and the ways in which the response to those storms has contributed to a changing national approach to disaster policy in the years since. An approach that increasingly integrates attention to social, economic, political, and environmental perspectives. So I hope everyone who's here with us today already knows that our work here at the Urban Institute is rooted in evidence and analysis, with the goal of arming policymakers, practitioners on the ground, and the broader public with facts. Because we think facts matter, that they enable people to make informed decisions that advance the well-being of people and communities. So we have a really fantastic panel of experts to engage in this conversation today. Phil Burke is the Professor of Land Use and Environmental Planning at Texas A&M University and Director of the Institute of Sustainable Coastal Communities at College Station. Kashana Hill is the Executive Director of the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center. Carlos Martin is Senior Fellow here at the Urban Institute in our Center on Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy. And Marion McFadden is Vice President for Public Policy at Enterprise Community Partners. Joining us virtually today is Angela Blanchard, who's President and CEO of Baker Ripley, which some of us got to know as neighborhood centers. It has a long and incredibly impressive track record of work throughout the Houston region to revitalize communities so they better support the aspirations of low-income families and the integration of immigrants and refugees. Just today, we saw the announcement that Angela is one of 5 of this year's winners of the Heinz Award, which recognizes contributions to, quote, making powerful changes for good. And I think when you hear Angela speak, you will second her selection for that prize. So not surprisingly, Angela couldn't leave Houston to join us here in person because Baker Ripley continues to operate an emergency shelter at the Energy Center. But she's shared some of her experience and her insights in the immediate aftermath of Harvey. And if I can master this technology, we'll hear a little bit from her first.
So the story of how Baker Ripley transformed overnight, well, in even shorter period of time than that, from a community development organization to a disaster response shelter management, is this. There's the man who leads our county, the highest ranking county official here, goes by a judge title. His name is Judge Ed Emmett. I have a high regard for him. He's a strong leader, tremendously ethical, and very, very focused on doing the best he can for the over 4 million people of Harris County. And so on August 29th, around 9:30, I got a text from a board member saying, Ed's going to call you and he's going to need some help. So I had a feeling that it might be something big. We knew what was coming our way. So I called a couple of the team members I have that are really, really good and at figured out leadership, the kind of leadership you really need when you're faced with a lot of unknowns, but you still have to get stuff done. So when I found out they were not underwater and they could come to work, I called Judge Emmett, and he said, can you stand up a shelter at NRG for 10,000 people? And I said, yes, we can. How long do I have? He said, how long do you need? I said, well, 24 hours. So we went to work as if lives depended upon it. We felt they did. And we set up the reception area, and we did that as if people were checking into a hotel. We insisted that everyone on site refer to the people coming our way as guests or neighbors. And we set up the reception area as a welcoming place, a place where when you arrived, you felt not only like you had shelter, but like you had made a friend. And, frankly, we used decades of experience in welcoming people from all over the world to our centers in Houston. We used our basic and foundational values of respect and our obsession with preserving the dignity of human beings we seek to help, no matter what situation we're in. So we put all of that to work, and then we set up the area for the volunteers, and then we set up an area for food service and a place for children, because number one thing you must do if you're going to stabilize the shelter is provide a place for children. Parents can't focus on the tasks of organizing a transition plan if their children aren't cared for and the kids can't learn and play. So we did all that, and while we were doing it, about 2 o'clock then, I got a call from Judge Emmett, and he said, how's it coming? I said, it's going along pretty well. We feel pretty good about it. We're waiting on cots. We don't have enough FEMA cots, but we think we have a donor, so we're going to work it out. And he said, well, how about opening today? And I said, as in this day, the one we're in? Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah, we've got buses coming, and we have no place for the people in them. So he said, so how long before you can welcome them? And I said, well, all right, then can we have 6 more hours? And he said, yeah, I'll announce it at 9 then, giving a little leeway. So I basically said to the team that was already here, find the 3 people that, just like you, that you can trust to do whatever it takes. Get them here. We've got this much time and we have to make it work. And so we did. And it gave me some measure of delight to email him 30 minutes before 9 o'clock and an hour and a half before the first guests were due to arrive and say, we're ready, send us the people. And I just like to note the things that made that possible. First, we did all of that on a handshake because I trust Ed Emmett. I know him as a person, and I know he wouldn't hang me out to dry. and he wouldn't ask me to do that if we didn't really need to. And the second thing, because the speed of trust is actually incredibly important in this scenario. The second thing was, we're a strength-based organization. Every one of us understands where we're great, when we're great, how we're great, and we know that about one another. So when we went into this scene, when we went into this situation, we went into it fully aware that we were going to each do exactly what we did best, and we'd take turns leading depending on what we had to accomplish at that moment. And it was a moment-by-moment unfolding scenario. And the reason we had to do this is that the scale of disasters we're having now really doesn't allow for those rescue operations that we used to be able to rely on to reach us in time. We can't wait for federal responses, and we can't wait for national organizations, because they have to bring in people from outside of the scene, and often they can't and they couldn't in this situation. So we did it, and we didn't sleep for 36 hours. And I can tell you, when you pass the 24-hour mark, it's dicey. But it was necessary, and we've learned so much from this experience about what we're capable of when it's really necessary, and about what we're willing to do for our neighbors. I think in the future, the most important message of all of this is that we should stop preparing for disasters. There's no way to prevent the displacement of people in storms and after wars and in a lot of other situations. So what we need to prepare for is to be really swift and effective at standing up landing places, welcoming places, and then creating the on-ramps afterwards to opportunity and to recovery.
I have been fortunate enough to be able to visit some of the centers that Angela has created in Houston. And so much of what I admired there is reflected in the institutional strength, the relationships with other institutions within Houston, and this incredible commitment to respecting the dignity of the people she serves. So it's really a pleasure to hear that. So I thought we might now just broaden this conversation about local and federal planning and response to disasters like Harvey and Irma. And so for each of our experts here, as you saw the impacts of these hurricanes unfold in Texas and Florida and the larger world, what were the biggest or top of mind issues or concerns that came to you? What did you find yourself maybe waking up in the middle of the night worrying about based on the experience you've had? And maybe, Marian, can we start with you?
Sure. And before I start, let me just say thank you to Marge and Carlos and Erica for having us here on behalf of all the panelists. Before I started Enterprise a year ago, I spent 15 years in the federal government working on disaster recovery at HUD. And at HUD, the agency hears from interested citizens and academic institutions and policy wonks on the regular programs, but somehow the growing role of disaster recovery has been outside of that framework. So I felt the absence of sustained public discussion. So despite the terrible circumstances that bring us here today, I'm really excited to see more conversation going on about how the federal government can do this better. So not being in the affected area, I had the luxury of worrying in the middle of the night about the long-term recovery, about the amount of time it was going to take to get the communities up to a new normal. Definitely, there are lessons that have been learned over and over in the major recoveries, whether that goes all the way back to Hurricane Andrew or to Katrina, Rita, Wilma, Sandy. There are many lessons that need to come forward. So thinking about what that means for people on the ground, it means it's going to be a while before you have permanent decisions made in the community about how the rebuilding is going to happen. Congress acted very swiftly in filling up the FEMA coffers and making sure SBA had loan assistance for homeowners and small business owners, and gave money to HUD for long-term rebuilding. But there are a lot of decisions that are going to have to come down the pike now. So really thinking about that amount of time and those critical decisions was top of mind for me.
Thanks. Phil, coming more from a local perspective and a local
Okay.
planning perspective, what was top of mind for you?
Well, as somebody that teaches and has done research and been to many disaster sites over the years in different parts of the world, one of the greatest things I think is if you're not planned, if you're not anticipating the event or set of events, if it's low on your priority, it's not within an election cycle, say of a mayor or a politician, we discount the risk. We don't act on it. And that's natural unless we have good leadership. And so anticipating change and looking into the future is particularly, that ability is particularly acute, I think, when we start looking at risk in cities. Just from climate to rapid growth in dangerous areas to growing inequities. And so I think the role of planning, pre-disaster planning, which we do very little of in this country effectively, and is increasingly important. And I think the epitome of a kind of a light footprint on planning is the Houston area. I have family there. I drive in and out. I live in a little place, College Station, Texas A&M University. And the three things I always noticed long before the event was, one, the rapid growth. I mean, many coastal cities around the world, Houston's very rapid, dynamic economy, rapid growth. The second, that combine that with sprawl. Don't plan, just let it happen, an unfettered market, kind of a light touch approach. So what happens is there's prairies and wetlands in the Houston metropolitan area. They have an absorptive capacity to take in rainfall, stormwater. Not that they would have prevented, if we had protected all of them, that they would have prevented a Harvey and 4 feet of rain. But they still, there's the more everyday event. And then the everyday event in Houston is the $500 million storm. You know, the 2 preceding years, we had $1 billion of damages from 2 events, 16 people lost. It's $500 million a year, roughly. And that's increasingly becoming a regular occurrence. And so the environment, sensitivity to the landscape, the wetlands, the prairies, the root systems go very deep in some of these high-quality prairie ecosystems across the landscape out in the Houston region. And we've lost a huge, tremendous amount of that. The landscape is not, homogeneous. Some areas are more sensitive and provide more life support functions than others for cities. And we need to be sensitive to these. And so that's been kind of largely not accounted for. A second thing is that Houston is all about infrastructure. They have world-class highway building. There's 23 lanes drive the Katy Freeway. The new I-99 loop, I think it's a state funded. They didn't wait for the federal. Can do, Texas. You can fit Rhode Island in size of the new loop they're building there. What does that loop do? It opens up the periphery to low-cost land, and so there's and the traffic congestion, they kind of manage it better than many other places. But what they don't manage well, if you look at the investment in stormwater managed infrastructure, it's barely keeping up. There's no state funding. There's no, the city, and like the Harris County Flood Control District, does it on its own. They try to do a lot, but they have a limited budget. Nothing like the highway building that's going on. So unfettered growth opened up by highway infrastructure and loss of ecological functions. Those are the 3 things that really have been in my head for the years I've been in Texas. I'm still been there 4 years, but when I drive in down 290 into the downtown from where I live, and I just notice that constantly, and I think nothing's going to prevent a Harvey, 4 feet plus, 50-something inches, but there are things that we can do better, and that is thinking about these events and these extremes, and it's the planning. Planning's critical.
Kashana?
So the work that I do in New Orleans is focused on equitable access to housing, right? Because of the links between housing and outcomes in lives. And so a lot of the work that we were doing post-Katrina in New Orleans was really focused around systemic inequity in the recovery that we found. So, you know, in thinking about sort of what would be on the horizon for the communities impacted by Harvey and now Hurricane Irma, several concerns sort of came to mind. One was, and I think Marianne kind of touched on this a little, but what is going to be the role of impacted community members in developing recovery plans? Are impacted community members going to be consulted? Will there be a public discussion with people who are affected, with community members? Will they have a say in creating what the recovery plans are? Unfortunately, we've seen time and time again that that doesn't happen, to the detriment of very vulnerable folks. So in New Orleans, we live in a city where the majority of people are renters. About 53% of the people living in the city of New Orleans rent. Yet after Hurricane Katrina, when more than half of the housing stock was destroyed and taken offline, there was no comprehensive plan at the city level to replace rental housing. And so the majority of the federal dollars that were coming in for rebuilding and for recovery work were going toward homeowners. And those needs certainly need to be addressed, but there needed to also be some sort of plan in place for people who were renting homes. And what we found there was, because there was no plan to address the lack of rental homes, we really created a very tight market where people who were low income were pushed to the margins. And so we've seen skyrocketing rents. Post-Katrina, we now know that rents have risen over 40%. But household wages have remained stagnant. They've increased at only about 2%. And so people are having a very tough time being able to find housing that they can afford at many income levels across the city. What happens to public housing residents is also a huge concern. I know that Houston's dynamics are a little different than those in New Orleans, but New Orleans is a city where a large number of people are actually living in poverty. And so we've got 25% of the renters that receive federal rent assistance. Either they're living in public housing units or they receive housing choice vouchers. And so after Katrina, what the city did was sort of follow the trend that was happening across the country of demolishing public housing units. And we had many thousands of units in New Orleans that were taken offline, whether or not those units received any water from the storm. And the residents were largely given vouchers, and they were promised that they would be able to take those vouchers into the private market and find the housing that was best suited for their needs. We know that that hasn't been the case. Only about 600 to 700 units of public housing have actually been replaced. And instead, all those other folks who were living in public housing have been given vouchers and have been pushed to the margins of this housing market. We also know that post-Katrina, because of the lack of planning, or in large part because of the lack of planning, we are now a city that is more segregated post-disaster than we were pre-disaster. And part of that is because large swaths of the city have become unaffordable and inaccessible to people of color. And so thinking about the ways in which the recovery needs to happen so that it's equitable is going to be really important. And that means not only sort of paying attention to what happens to renters, to vulnerable folks, to public housing residents, but also will there be equitable access to the resources that are going to flow through. Will certain neighborhoods receive more resources than others? That's something else that we saw happen post-Katrina. And I think the last thing that's sort of been on my mind is that it's going to be very important for local government following disasters to ensure that the dollars that flow into their communities, the housing dollars that flow, will not be used in a way that further perpetuates segregation. One thing that we know has happened in the New Orleans area is there had been a tendency to just rebuild or build more affordable housing in high poverty communities of color. And so it's going to be really important in Houston in particular that city policymakers and local officials look at what they can do to ensure that the dollars go toward building, for instance, some affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods, and not just going with a plan that further entrenches or perpetuates segregation. I'll say that many of you may know that in the Baton Rouge area in Louisiana, we suffered some historic flooding last August. And so since that event, there's been a new mayor elected, and she and some city council members in that area have been really engaging in some thoughtful conversations with community members and have been very careful about how dollars are allocated. And they're really working to come up with a concrete, solid plan that will provide housing for vulnerable people, but that will also open up access. And so the plan that they are working on is one that will certainly not just continue to cite affordable housing in high poverty neighborhoods. And so it's important that local governments look at taking advantage of the opportunity that comes with rebuilding post-disaster.
I think some interesting themes across your two comments are about how storms or disasters of this kind reveal the legacy of past decisions or past policies, and it resurfaces the need for capacity, which I think Carlos is going to highlight, about to plan, to act in different ways.
Yeah, and certainly hearing Angela's words, I think takes me back, probably takes most of the people in the room back to 3 weeks ago, and that sort of visceral lump we have in our stomachs, and the prayer that we all have of please not again, because we have this history of repeating these. And so from the research side, all the research we've done with regard to disaster recovery and mitigation, I think it's important to think about what we want to see happen again and what we don't want to see happen again. I think we have, to generalize, I think there are 5 key factors that we've seen repeatedly in a lot of these, particularly in the milestones of Katrina, of Andrew, Katrina, Sandy, and now Harvey and Irma. Number 1 is money, financial resources. This is both what's allotted at the federal level, but down to individuals and what resources they have. 2, leadership. I was heartened by the comment by Angela about the issue of trust that was developed, because she had this trust. So when we're talking about leadership, we mean not just being able to get stuff done, which is very important, particularly in relief moments, but also being transparent and honest and having a commitment to accountability in the longer term. I think that's the kind of leadership that we've seen repeatedly is what helps communities get past the finish line in their recovery. 3rd, I would say information. This is knowledge about what to do, when to do it, but it also means data, knowing right now what's the damage, what's the demography of the damage, and also what are the behaviors of these people. What is their incident, what is their history of relationship with public services, with their neighbors. There's all sorts of behavioral information that we don't know, that usually we just rely on that early damage report and where the damage lies and who is damaged. 4th, I would say it's actually inclusion. We've seen in examples like Rebuild by Design the importance of really involving neighbors and individuals that are affected in their visioning of their community. I think in many cases we rush, particularly in times of relief and recovery, to make plans without really diving into people's needs and listening to people. And I think this is Angela's soapbox, is that we always need to listen to people. So that's important in that. And the 5th, I'd say, is probably less obvious, and it's sort of a categorization, sort of a clearinghouse of all the others, but it's capacity. It's that very issue about capacity. And we're talking at every scale, from the federal government down to individual capacity. I mean, there's the old adage that we don't know our strengths until we're tested, right? But we also often don't know our weaknesses, and we often usually don't want to talk about our weaknesses. But the combination of our strengths and our weaknesses, that holistic strategy, which is something groups like the 100 Resilient Cities program are trying to perpetuate, is that holism is really what defines our capacity, and that's where we are today.
So I think maybe we could just extend the conversation about capacity a little bit. I think one of the issues you've raised, Phil, is about smaller communities and their capacity both to plan effectively and prepare, but then also to respond.
Right, and I apologize how I tend to frame things a little bit on Harvey, but I'm tired and I came to Washington to get some sanity. It's true. And that's nice sleep I had last night, so I appreciate Urban Institute inviting me here. But capacity is one of the narratives going on. I think it's a good narrative. It's a common narrative. Is the small rural community, the Rockport, Texas, is 250 miles, 20 miles south of Houston, devastated, flattened. Port Aransas, Aransas Pass, places like that, and they're low capacity. These are small cities, lots of low-income people, but also something closer to me is inner-city neighborhoods, and we have a pre-existing partnerships at the Institute for Sustainable Communities. We've been working in a number of neighborhoods inside Houston that are marginalized, deeply marginalized, and don't have a voice, and they feel left alone. And we had a little barbecue there Sunday because some of our students in our college, the old Texas barrels on their side with a barbecue pit, brought down 500 hamburgers to grill. People were crying at the end in tears because somebody came, somebody cared. This is in the Manchester neighborhood in Texas. And I think that what that one place, because we have pre-existing trust and relationships with this one neighborhood, among others, because we've been in there working with them on citizen science research grants so we can get master's theses and dissertations for our students, but frame information to find what the community needs and leave capacity behind because they're actually involved in data collection, analysis, bringing in the high school kids from the neighborhood, that type of thing. So we've been doing that for the last couple of years. And what happened after the event was this is a highly polluted neighborhood. I'm using one example. It's around the Houston Ship Channel. There are multiple petrochemical plants in the surrounding that. They have air quality and water quality problems, standing puddles of water, these type of things. And that leachate up the old waste site that is built on top of many landfills, recycling plants on the petrochemical. They called us and said, we smell stuff. We see stuff coming out from our groundwater. It's percolating up from all the flooding. Nobody here is taking testing. So we went down and started testing. And we had teams of graduate students led by a senior faculty member, Summer, who were intimidated during the testing. The chemical plants, the petrochemicals would come out with teams of thugs on the back of their pickup trucks coming towards us and intimidating. And this is a neighborhood that's long fought this environmental injustice. So I think there was a capacity building because of a pre-existing with this neighborhood. And I think that I wish the government, the city government, these are one-off. When we start working with nonprofits or the university, they're one-off relationships. And I'd like to see this kind of, built in. I think there's some ideas on the panel about doing that. But when we think before a disaster, we have this pre-event planning, these pre-disaster recovery planning or pre-disaster mitigation plans that we just,
Katrina, the discussion of trust reminds me really strongly of New Orleans immediately after Katrina, that there was a profound lack of trust with good reason, and that really interfered with the ability to make some decisions about the rebuilding process that might really have benefited a lot of people, but that the lack of trust just got in the way of constructive conversations around tough issues. And I don't know whether you think that that some trust has been built in New Orleans since, or how to tackle that challenge in the recovery and rebuilding process.
Well, I think in New Orleans, I think there has been some trust that's been built, rebuilt, reestablished, but I think that there's, certainly always room to go, particularly if you're, talking about a local government entity. I don't think it's ever a good idea to say, oh, we're there now, so we don't need to keep working on it. At this time, we do have a mayoral administration and leaders at the local level that are interested in continuing to engage community around housing issues. But we know that housing is a very critical issue in our city for community members, for people who are going to be voting in the upcoming municipal elections. We just held a candidates forum where a couple hundred people turned out to hear specifically about the candidates' stances on housing issues. And so engaging around those issues, I think, is a critical way to continue to build that trust. And I think that sort of this vacuum that you're talking about really led to an expansion in our priorities as an organization, and expanded the capacity out of necessity of the organization. And so what ended up happening with us is that there was a need for people to have a resource to go to be able to figure out how to get help to access, for instance, Road Home dollars. And Road Home was the rebuilding program for homeowners, and people needed help being able to figure out, they needed help figuring out the paperwork and the process and who to call and where to submit things. And so we started a program where we were working with homeowners who were trying to figure out how to get back to the city. And that work has shifted a bit over time now that we're 12 years away from the storm itself, but we are still continuing to work with homeowners in New Orleans, now people who are facing foreclosure, because we realized post-Katrina that the city lost a lot of wealth in communities of color. And so as part of our mission, we think it's very important that we try and stop that loss where we can. And so we provide HUD-certified foreclosure prevention counseling, but that capacity was built out of the need for people to be able to access direct services in trying to get those Road Home dollars and comply with that program. The other piece of our work that expanded because of a need was our policy advocacy work. Before the storm, we were doing that work to the extent that leadership was able to be involved with a campaign here or a coalition effort there. But it became pretty clear post-storm that it was going to be important to build up a policy advocacy team so that we could be working with groups and communities to put forth proactive measures that might help the next time we were faced with a natural disaster.
And Marion, how about the federal government's capacity perhaps to step in and support local and states, but in particular governments that lack capacity and are suddenly faced with these overwhelming demands?
I mean, I think overwhelming is exactly the right word. You don't get federal assistance for disaster recovery until the governor makes a declaration. This has overwhelmed our ability to respond. And I think since Katrina, we've seen the federal government doing a better job of understanding that there needs to be a focus on long-term recovery right away. So the agencies are getting in there or sending contractors in to talk about long-term recovery almost from day one. So those discussions are ramping up now because there are a lot of policy decisions at the federal government level and at the state and local level that are going to have to be made that they should be preparing for now. So in the housing context, you mentioned the Road Home, and that was essentially where Louisiana made a plan not to make a plan for homeowners. Each individual homeowner could choose from a menu of options and come back to their property or not. But if they chose to come back, the amount of money they got wasn't the amount they needed to rebuild. For a variety of reasons, all with the best of intentions at every level along the way, the thought was it'll be faster and more efficient. you know, when you're looking at hundreds of thousands of homes that need to be repaired, to just give money to the homeowner to make those repairs and let the homeowner take control. But in reality, if people weren't given the amount they needed to do that work, and on a very personal level, many people were traumatized and overwhelmed and unable to make those decisions, it just didn't result in the level of rebuilding that was predicted, and it had a disparate impact. So if the amount of assistance you got was based on how much your house was worth before the storm, you can understand what that means for communities of color and for low-income people. They just did not get enough money in their hands. So looking at what are the rules going to be that the federal government puts out for this rebuilding, or the state or county, wherever the money lands, that's a decision, at least on the HUD side, that's a decision with the secretary who gets the money. One of those big questions is what's going to be required? After Hurricane Sandy, the requirements for for rebuilding housing with federal dollars were to do actual rehabilitation programs to ensure that every house was brought back up to code and inspected so that it would be more resilient in the end as well as healthy. We haven't touched on resilience yet, but that's another big question in front of the federal government right now. So the Obama administration had rolled out new standards for rebuilding in the floodplain. So if federal money was being used for new construction of a property or substantial reconstruction, and it was in the floodplain, it was going to have to be elevated for residential housing 2 to 3 feet above the current risk, with the understanding that an investment of that size is supposed to last for decades. So don't just think about what's the current risk to the property, what might that be in the future? As we're facing increasing intensity and severity of storms, what does that mean? So President Trump rolled those back just a couple of weeks before the storm. Secretary Carson and White House advisor have said we're going to see new resilience standards, but what are those going to be? And if they're not really going to be imposing standards for future proofing at the federal level, then it rolls to the state or the county to make those decisions for the city.
One of my recollections from Katrina was that in part because of the lack of trust between communities of color and the leadership of the city, that the conversations about phasing neighborhood rebuilding or rebuilding whole neighborhoods, they just crashed and burned. And essentially this, okay, one homeowner at a time, one house at a time, was kind of, we give up. We lack the capacity, we lack the trust to do something more systematic in the face of this kind of destruction.
Also, I would say there are challenges of just putting multiple funding sources together, having to do an environmental review. If you know anything about the federal government, you know that the money comes with a lot of strings. And so Congress made some efforts to try and reduce that after Hurricane Sandy and allow, if one agency is doing an environmental review, if FEMA comes first, another one to come behind. I would absolutely encourage Congress to go broader this time and make it so that if one agency is doing the review, that's it. You don't have to add to that amount of time.
Right.
Bill?
Yeah, one of the concerns I'd love to see the federal government do better is that local governments are, they deal with a plethora of plans. They're actually flooded with plans. And I've seen this emerge over the decades. And a consolidated plan maybe for housing, a land use plan because the state requires it, comprehensive plan, a parks plan, maybe a transportation plan, capital improvements program plans. And so what happens is you can get, there's so many plans and then they're kicked in a hazard mitigation plan. Every local government from FEMA says you get to funnel through mitigation funding after an event, you have to have a hazard mitigation plan. So what happens is these plans are isolated. More than not, we have a significant research project we've been underway about 4 years now, where we find if you look at a city and look at the different neighborhoods and how planning takes place, whether it's transportation corridors or neighborhood scale or a sensitive environmental area, historic, whatever. You have these plans that play out differently because the policies and the actions built in these plans are spatial. And oftentimes, the transportation, I've seen this right before Hurricane Sandy, I was looking at the hazard mitigation plan for a couple of New Jersey coastal communities and looking at their comprehensive plan and the land use. Hazard mitigation plan, one city in particular said, severe repetitive loss zone in FEMA, 100-year floodplain, repetitive loss that qualifies for buyout. The same area in the comprehensive plan says, well, Jersey has this model ordinance that local governments can use for redeveloping blighted areas. Okay? So we want to put complete streets, infrastructure. We want to have mixed use, higher density, mixed uses, all these things, it's smart growth, all that, same exact area. So, I mean, that we need. I've had conversations with FEMA about trying to get a more coordination. And it's not, local governments are adopting these plans on their own, but also there's a lot of them coming down from different federal agencies. And we don't have one pre-disaster recovery planning. Integrated pre-disaster recovery, there's none.
If I could just add briefly to Phil's comments. I mean, part of what we've seen immediately after, during the transition from relief to recovery, as communities are developing their action plans for disaster recovery funding, is that they rarely address their original consolidated plan that they had submitted to HUD, their comprehensive plan that they have internally. So it's as if all things are thrown out in that moment, which for a lot of reasons you want to sort of get things done very quickly. But when I was referring to capacity earlier, it wasn't just capacity at the moment of the disaster and in the couple weeks during relief. That's what we often think of when we think of emergency capacity. But it's actually thinking about, I was heartened to hear Kashana talk about the capacity 12 years after the fact in her community, the communities that she represents. And that's really the kind of capacity I think that we're missing out on. Mm-hmm. We've had experiments after Sandy with thinking about the flood protection, the management standards, Rebuild by Design, National Disaster Resilience Competition, where we're looking forward, where we're doing better on recovery capacity so that we have better mitigation capacity. And certainly, I'd like to say, in all fairness for FEMA and HUD, they've done a lot better over the last 12 years in terms of the relief side and transitioning from relief to recovery. But it's a longer term mitigation where we still have so many gaps.
And maybe not just longer term mitigation, but I think, Kashana, you talked about the challenges of rebuilding in a way that does not just replicate and reproduce the inequities that we had before, the segregation that we had before, the exposure to environmental contamination that we had before.
And I think when we talk about sort of the plans and integrating plans, this is why it's so important to do that. You know, if there isn't a con plan that a jurisdiction is operating pursuant to, or if the con plan or any other plans are ignored in creating the recovery plan, then you run into a situation where the recovery efforts can be inequitable and where the requirement to affirmatively further fair housing is just tossed out and isn't going to be complied with because you've been operating sort of outside of all of these other documents and nothing has been integrated if you focus just solely on the recovery without going back and looking at what's in place. And on the other side, if nothing is already in place, then when there is a disaster, then it can be hard to ensure that the recovery plan is in compliance with federal law.
Not surprisingly, the largest fair housing settlements that HUD has ever made have been after disaster recovery. So after Hurricane Sandy, just in New Jersey, there was a $240 million settlement because the initial programs rolled out by the state didn't reach people with limited English proficiency, didn't reach people living in manufactured housing. There was confusion about whether people were eligible and didn't go into apartment assistance. So it's on the grand scale when this kind of money is involved, and the pressures are so great on the people responsible for administering the program. So in quiet times, you get 1 million different plans because there are different requirements from different funding sources. Even within one agency, you may have requirements for different plans. But to amplify the point, after disaster, it's so important that the entity of government that's receiving the money has one office controlling, one office asking the questions, making those connections back, but putting it all together because despite the tragic circumstances, this is probably the best financial opportunity the community is going to have to rebuild itself.
So
And when done well, can address problems that existed before the disaster, solve for multiple problems.
Let me bring Angela back in the context of equity and vulnerable people. Houston is a city of immigrants, and Angela Blanchard has a very long history of helping immigrants and refugees arrive, be welcomed, and integrate into local communities in ways in which they can achieve their goals for their families and kids. And so she had
So
thoughts.
while we were working to stand up this shelter, get it running, and welcoming buses of guests and neighbors to the shelter, we also learned that the president was rescinding DACA. The Dreamers in Texas we have the largest share in the nation. We're lucky that way. And we also employ them at Baker Ripley, where I'm CEO. They're in our schools, they're in our colleges, they're in our workplaces, they're all around us. And so it added quite a bit to the heartbreak of what we were in the midst of, to hear such an ugly message from the White House on the heels of his visit to this shelter. And we went about what we've always done for 110 years at this agency. We went about thinking about how to protect and shield and shelter those people. And we'll be working hard on that. And we have some really good ideas about how to do it. We're not giving up, and we're not turning back. And we do know how to hunker down.
You wanted to add a...
Well, that's hard to follow.
Sorry.
Yeah. Urban Institute asked me to mention something about our research on equity, and we look at the plans. I'm a city planner that's interested in environment and risk, social equity, and one of our projects is looking at how well are social equity built into the network of plans that local governments are adopting. And you see a lot on built environment vulnerability, financial safety, built environment, okay? Infrastructure, a lot of data in these plans. There's even data to a lesser extent on the ecology, protecting, how ecosystems like mangroves, these kinds of things mitigate risk. But when it comes to social vulnerability, and we have these indices developed, CDC, they're readily available now because of the very accessible digitally. I'm not talking about capacity, but they are readily available, and you never see them. They're not. We've looked at hundreds of plans. You don't see social vulnerability and social vulnerability mapping. And I think that's whose voice is being heard when these plans are being created. And I'll even say some of the we've just looked at 6 cities. The paper's under review, and we've found that social vulnerability isn't paid attention to in terms of the policy and actions in networks of plans. And we found the one plan that tries the hardest to rectify inequities tends to not account as much for social vulnerability. Those are the housing plans. Mm-hmm. Because they're worried about, and I understand that, because there's an inverse correlation, statistic, Pearson's R, where we find that the higher the social vulnerability, the more emphasis there is on redevelopment, improving housing in the flood. When we're looking at in the floodplain, in the 100-year floodplain of 6 cities we've looked at, from Boston to Fort Lauderdale to Tampa to League City, Texas to Norfolk. And so, we need to, just getting the voice is just not being heard in a strong enough way. And I think HUD's the main lead agency that can get attention of the other agencies to do this. But even with the HUD plans, the housing, that I can name specific, but very specific.
And HUD has a lot of discretion at this exact moment because they've gotten the money from Congress and they're writing the rules. And when Congress actually gives that money to HUD, they say the HUD secretary can waive statutes, not just regulations, but statutes that he administers in providing that assistance. So HUD can now just say to the state or whoever the funds are going to, you have to use this much of it to address your housing need. And really ensure that the most vulnerable people are served first. It's kind of weedy, but another important issue that HUD could address is whether you set income caps on who can receive grant assistance. So the way it's been done in past disasters is it's up to whoever receives the money to set the rules. So you saw after Hurricane Sandy, New Jersey set caps to say nobody gets more than $150,000 to rehabilitate their home. And you're not eligible for one of those grants if you make more than $250,000. New York State and New York City effectively did not set those kinds of caps. One way that HUD could deal with that, or that the jurisdictions could deal with that, is by saying, if you're over a certain income, say 120% of area median income, apply for an SBA loan first. The Small Business Administration makes low interest loans available. Go there first and then come back for a grant for whatever amount of money you need to finish your recovery once you get that loan. That's a tool available to stretch the money and ensure that the people who can't pay for the recovery get the benefit of a grant first.
We're going to open it up to everyone else in just a minute, but I wanted to bring us one more clip of Angela. And I think we've been too agreeable so far. So it may be that this one triggers a little disagreement.
The unprecedented scale of impact is one part of a measure of Harvey's destruction. But what we also experienced here was Harvey dumped 33 trillion gallons of water in a really short period of time on the Texas Gulf Coast. And if you want to try to imagine what that means, Katrina was a 6.5 trillion gallon event. This was a 33 trillion gallon event. And so we view those, we have to look at that and say, we understood from the start that flooding was impossible to avoid, and that what we really needed to do was think ahead about what we were going to do in the immediate aftermath. Allison taught us a lot about rain events that didn't include wind, that how devastating they could be, how expensive they could be, where the loss of life could occur. And we prepared for that. And I want to point out something incredibly important. I've given talks for years on response to displacement and disaster. And at some point in every talk I say, no one's coming. And that's not a cynical message. It's not a hopeless message. It's a message of the way to prepare yourself for the unprecedented. People who wait, people who imagine someone bigger, better, stronger is going to show up at the most painful and excruciating moments following a disaster have more trouble than those of us who understand that in some measure we'll always be on our own, and whether that's for a few days or a few weeks. We had been awaiting a mental health team, a federal mental health team, that would come and look at the way we've set up the shelter. And when that team arrived, we integrated them quickly, oriented them quickly. They quickly told us, did a thorough examination of what we were doing here. We got enormously positive feedback. We set up an additional session, and before that session occurred, they left and they went east, and where they're going to be needed. And the biggest lesson, again and again, is not that no one's ever going to come, or that there's no help available, or that no one cares, But if you want the response to be as inexpensive and as effective as possible, we're all first responders at the scene of any disaster impacting us.
Oof. I could start off thinking that, I think I like to think as Americans, we always think that if our brothers or sisters are in need, we're going to be there for them. That there's always going to be an angel or a helper, somebody offering help. Certainly, folks like Angela, a lot of the residents within the Houston area are out there in their boats. But in many ways, Angela's right. In many ways, we have a lot of agency as individuals about where we go and what we do. And I think that's especially true in this longer term planning. I think in the short term, we're seeing the heroes in Houston, we're seeing them in Florida, ideally in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands as well. But what you can do to make sure that you're keeping yourself safe in the long term, I think is a bigger issue. Sort of the mitigation opportunities that you have, what we're doing as a nation in terms of insurance, what resources you have for mitigating your own home, even just knowing in the short term what your evacuation plan is. How many people in the room have an emergency kit at home? Show of hands? Not so many. I'm happy. Everybody on the panel has one. Maybe. But certainly these issues about our own agency. When, again, talking about capacity, it's not just the capacity of the institutions, the federal government, the state and local governments, especially the rural communities that have challenges, and the poor rural communities, but also we as individuals, what we can do to help ourselves, as well as still look out for our brothers and sisters.
Thanks.
I came here planning to vigorously disagree with Carlos. But actually, in the first clip, Angela said, we need to stop preparing for disasters. From a long-term perspective, I would say it's actually the opposite. We all need to prepare for disasters. My mother used to say it's a sign of intelligence that you can learn from other people's mistakes instead of making them yourself. Mm-hmm. I think maybe she did this because I was the second child in the family. But as we're having this conversation, it's not just about Texas and Florida or Louisiana. It's about all the communities across the country, and how do we take this idea of resilience and mitigation and disaster out of the unique boutique discussion and make it about just the new normal and how we do business. 2 of the 4 largest cities in the United States were walloped by disasters in under 5 years. There is a new normal upon us. So how do we incorporate that into all the building and planning that we do?
Since we've talked a lot about the federal government and in fact about HUD, I thought that we would have the first comments or reactions or maybe questions from the audience to come from Todd Richardson, who I'd like to recognize as Acting General Deputy Assistant Secretary. Is that the title now? Yeah. At HUD. And Todd has had decades of experience working at HUD through disaster relief and recovery efforts. And we'd really love to hear your perspective these days.
So I'll be quick. So I have in my house, I have a little bag that's got all the stuff for emergencies, but we opened it recently and it had diapers in it. And all of my kids
Your kids are in college now, right?
well past that age. So it's good if you have one of these things to look at it now and again to see if you've got the right equipment. But that actually gets to my question and comment. So I've been doing data around disasters since 1994. So I have the advantage of being in the federal government and having access to the individual level data from FEMA, SBA, and HUD, and looking at those data over the last several decades. One observation is clear, is that not enough people have adequate insurance, because recovery happens much faster with insurance. And after providing funding for disasters, many disasters in 2011, and disasters in 2012, 2013, 14, 15, 16, and now 17, the vast majority of those disasters are flooding disasters, and a very high percentage of folks that are in those flooding disasters are outside of floodplains and do not have flood insurance. So it took several decades for me to see this data to realize that I should buy flood insurance. So as Harvey was closing down on putting 50 inches of rain on Houston, I bought flood insurance. And by the way, it's very cheap. So for those of you who own homes outside of a floodplain, you may want to look into that. Because if you don't have it and you flood, you have to wait for whatever might come in terms of local recovery or your own resources or qualifying for an SBA loan. So that's my question to you then, is you haven't talked about insurance, and I'd be interested in hearing people's thoughts about insurance.
Great, thanks. You want to start, Phil?
Okay, one angle, I think this whole notion of, and you pointed it out, what the floodplain is. And the regulatory standards, the 100-year, I think high occupancy, maybe it might be wider than that, 500-year. But what is the 100-year storm? And the overwhelming number of flooded homes are outside the floodplain. I don't have the hard data, but I've been hearing in the media that that's the case in the Houston area and others. And we have sea level rise. We have increasing severity of precipitation events. We also build in the floodplain with impervious cover, which widens. So under the own local government control, there'll be you put more impervious cover in the floodplain, it's going to widen. So you bought a house out of the floodplain, now it's in the floodplain. And we don't have adequate, so I would like to see, along with purchasing insurance, this kind of a wider perspective. I almost think the 100-year floodplain works against it. And I think we also, stronger standards with the National Flood Insurance Program when it comes to making sure that public stormwater infrastructure keeps pace if there is urbanization. It doesn't have to be in the floodplain, but it still can cause wider floodplains. Stronger land use standards that will say, look, here's a wetland that has a function, and it may work not in a Harvey, or but in these kind of regular occurrences that we're seeing more and more, the new normal, as it was mentioned. And so those are kind of two aspects. Yeah.
If I can, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kashan. Just quickly, I think a lot of property owners in the United States still assume that their property insurance covers disasters. They don't realize that in the United States, unlike some other countries in the world, it's like everything is in one package. You have one insurance policy that covers all of your hazards. This part may be a source of contention. I actually think we have to have a national conversation about insurance reform. There's almost the same level as we have about health insurance in this country, particularly given the fact that not every hazard is covered in every individual's insurance. We don't have means-tested assistance for lower-income people who can't afford their insurance in the same way, particularly given the fact that NFIP is going to be based, the premiums are going to be based actuarially now. I think there's a lot of bigger discussion that we have to have about insurance in this country in the long term. And let's keep in mind that insurance covers property owners, not renters.
So I think that is the point I was going to make, is that reform is going to be extremely important. What we saw post-Katrina, there were people who did have insurance, flood insurance. There were folks who didn't, but the recovery effort was still sort of stymied by people working to piece together, all these various programs. What we know now, post-Katrina, though, is that flood insurance has become prohibitively expensive. And so there are people who are not able to enter the homeownership market because of the fact that flood insurance is so high. We have all of the insurers that have left the state of Louisiana. And so flood insurance is very, very hard to get. There's no competition. There's no ability to shop around for different pricing and different options. People who want to purchase insurance and purchase homes are stuck paying these exorbitant rates that are going to continue to go up. The flood maps are changing all the time. It's just a very complex system to navigate. I think when you're talking about houses outside of a flood zone or maybe in different communities that haven't experienced significant flooding, then the conversation looks a bit different. But in order to bring in those communities where flooding is a reality, then something is going to have to happen to change the flood insurance system.
So I would add on top of everything you all said that there's a real challenge. As a homeowner, yes, you should buy flood insurance and you should take it. But remember that after Hurricane Sandy, the flood insurance administrator went on 60 Minutes and confessed to fraud in the program because contractors that the government had hired were shorting homeowners for no reason that anyone could figure out, since they got paid the same amount by FEMA no matter how much damage they assessed. From a taxpayer perspective, the flood insurance program is already about $25 billion in the hole, and I saw a projection of $11 billion just after Hurricane Harvey. So that's not including Irma. So this national conversation that we need to have has to be bigger than just buy FEMA's flood insurance, which isn't actually actuarially sound, because FEMA doesn't have the data necessary to determine what the true risk on a property is. There is technology available, LiDAR technology, where you can fly in an airplane and assess the elevation on thousands of points on a piece of property, but FEMA hasn't had access to the resources to do that on a nationwide basis. Maybe the federal government already has that in the Defense Department. I don't know. Maybe it's already there and FEMA just can't get to it. I don't know. But I agree, we absolutely need that national conversation because it's going to make a big difference. You're seeing it already in Louisiana, that low-income people are priced out of buying a home or can't sell their home and are stuck in it because it's so expensive to get insurance.
Please.
It's just not to put too fine a point on it, but the other thing I would say is that I think it's also important to consider the way in which people come to home ownership and how that affects what they might know about insurance generally. So in New Orleans and in communities across the country where there is a legacy of racist housing policy that led to segregated neighborhoods, what we know is that poor and lower income African-American folks primarily, but other people of color who could not access bank loans, they built their own homes and built their own communities because they had to. They couldn't become homeowners any other way. And so New Orleans was a place where people who were lower income and working class could be homeowners, but they were homeowners not because they went out and accessed a program that allowed them to buy a home. They were homeowners because the house had been passed down by maybe their great-grandfather who built it in a certain community. And so oftentimes we saw that when people became homeowners that way, then they lacked access to education about maybe insurance or various other programs. So that's an important point to keep in mind. And then, of course, just reiterating the fact that sometimes the flood insurance conversation might leave out renters.
Yeah. And I'm happy just to follow up on both of these 2 points to note that the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center and the Urban Institute are launching a new project looking at insurance and home disclosures in the Greater New Orleans area, just to look at these concerns. The only thing I'd want to add in terms of what Marion said is, I mean, in addition to the national reform discussion that we have to have about insurance, it's a discussion about the federal role longer term. We're looking at a trend over 100 years in which local communities increasingly rely on the federal government for response. Just in the Harvey declarations, there have been exemptions of up to 90%, usually to 75% federal government role, 25% local in the bigger disasters. It's 90% now in the declaration for Harvey. So we're looking at even more money. So having mitigation strategies at the personal level and the local level save that money in the longer term. The rule of thumb is that every dollar spent on mitigation saves $4 in recovery. So we're looking at, if for anything, if other than humanitarian, other than social assistance, if you want to look at just the cost to federal coffers, this is the scenario we're in.
Before we went to Phil, I could just jump in real fast to say we saw that $1 invested brings you $4 in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago, or about a month ago. There was very heavy rainfall, and the sewer system didn't drain the water appropriately, and some of that public housing that had been rebuilt, the Faubourg Lafitte homes, were elevated above the standard that they had to be elevated to under the standards that federal government funds had at the time. And so the water, it was about waist deep, but it didn't breach the first floor. So there are no insurance claims on the property. And that's just, a few years later, it's already paid off.
Okay, last point before we go back
okay.
to
Yeah, I just, like to make a point too. And that study, Carlos, you mentioned the cost-benefit Adam Rose at the University of Southern California. The highest cost-benefit, or the most benefit cost, most benefit were the land use. Among that, building codes were high, but not nearly as high as the land use. Mm-hmm. And that's politically the most difficult, to change the urban form after the event, right? And I think, since we're on the flood insurance, I think the flood insurance program is a vehicle like the community rating system with maybe graduated sanctions, means testing, maybe for households, but you get more the more you do in terms of you get a bigger discount of insurance. And I think, I think though the insurance program should be more broadened to consider urban form, and it's going to be particularly more important because we're seeing seas rising, places like Houston and New York, Miami, and we see increasing, the weather is part of it, but also as our decisions to rebuild. And when you get 75, 90% public assistance to rebuild the roads and the streets and the police and the schools and all that from the federal government, we know we're being taken care of. We can keep, I'm in the land of, we don't plan, but give us the money.
Well, along those lines, I know.
just identify yourself and your organization, and here comes the mic.
All right. Well, thank you. My name is Dan Vach, and I'm a reporter with Governing Magazine. Piggybacking on that last point, I know FEMA under the Obama administration had talked about disaster deductibles for states and localities, and sort of giving them an incentive to prepare, to zone, to do better land use planning. Is that an effective strategy? I mean, I don't know what the prospects of that ever becoming, the law of the land are, but would that be an effective way to incentivize, states and localities to better prepare for disasters like this?
I would say that any incentive is a good incentive to help communities actually rethink their zoning. The problem with rethinking zoning and land use is so much of the communities exist already. So many new regulations are just about new development, and we're dealing with people who are already in their communities. So part of that conversation has to be, well, do we buy out and relocate communities and the homeowners, and that has to be on the table.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think, incentives are important. And when it comes to land use change, we're already seeing it. Places are relocating because they're being forced to. And we're going to see that more and more. I think a wonderful example of dealing with all this is if you look at, it started with the Rockefeller Center in Norfolk, Virginia. And they've come up with a very interesting plan, and they've said, look, they're changing their zoning ordinance right now. They're going to build this idea that came out of the Rockefeller plan, the 100 resilient city that Norfolk was part of. Says we need to take a look at this question of land use because we are in trouble. The most well-read book in the neighborhoods in Norfolk is the title, When's the High Tide, so I can move my car from the street up to the higher ground, right? In some of these neighborhoods. So Norfolk said some areas, like the downtown, and high investment, a lot of assets, we need to protect with structural reinforcement, that type of thing. It's very expensive, but they're worth protecting. Other areas are undeveloped, but at less risk. There may be higher ground. So maybe we're going to encourage, we're a growing city, we're going to try to change our zoning and our infrastructure and so on program to encourage development. Other areas are built up, varying incomes and so on, but the asset level is not quite as high. And maybe in terms of cost effectiveness, it's easier to relocate. Okay, but we're going to gradually do this. It's too expensive to protect everything. So they have these, they call them the green areas where they want to build up, not less risky, but room for more development. Is try to work with neighborhoods and gradually relocate don't expand any more infrastructure. And they're looking ahead. And
I can imagine this takes a tremendous attention to voice and equity to do something like that.
yes,
Completely.
yes, yes.
I'm going to go maybe 3 or 4 questions and comments before coming back to us so that we get more.
My name is Jerry Hush. I'm a sociologist who's actually worked with the UN for the last 25 years, most recently having to do with climate change adaptation, and worked in Africa and Asia. So I think I'd like to up the ante a little bit. I know that the focus has been on the 2 hurricanes and the national response, but I'd like to both get your response and also comment on the fact that this is not the only country that has had to deal with these disasters. And that, in my experience, working in other countries, there is a much greater recognition of the role of planning. And certainly now, as agencies and different organizations have gone in and said, look, we really have to deal with climate change. That's sort of like the elephant in the room right now. We have to recognize that our national policy is not aligned with much of progressive discussions about the environment and housing and certainly with resilience in the US. And I think that's something that needs to be up front and center. And I think one of the best examples is how is the recovery in the Caribbean going to be dealt with? Because we can immediately see 5 or 6 different countries, independent states, territories. We can immediately see the ideologies of those countries and how they view issues of equity and access to housing. So I think it's an extraordinarily complicated issue, and unless we are willing to learn with our global partners, we're going to be reinventing the wheel in the US.
Take in a few more questions. Yep.
Hi, my name's Brian. I'm with the National Coalition for Studies. We've been working on gathering information from member organizations right now about hurricane relief and natural disaster relief. Oh, thank you. And thanks to Enterprise's toolkit, we've had a lot of information on long-term planning on recovery. But my question is, for a service provider, a homeless service provider who's trying to help arguably the most vulnerable population when it comes to natural disasters, how can someone who's running a shelter, if they haven't created an ICS hierarchy, if they haven't done the proper long-term planning and they're receiving warning of a hurricane coming in a week or a few days, how can they plan best for that? So.
We have another one we'd like to add for now. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rachel Flaherman. I have a question about mitigation paying off in the long run and physical infrastructure. One of our most important types of physical infrastructure everywhere in this country is energy infrastructure. And it's really important for mitigation that we actually move to a different type of energy infrastructure, which would be infrastructure that does not emit carbon dioxide. So it seems like right now, with a White House that insists that carbon dioxide does not exacerbate Earth's greenhouse effect, when in fact it does. Maybe on the federal level that's not happening, but is there any state level awareness that you all have seen among state regulators to change the physical energy infrastructure now, especially in Texas maybe, where it's one of the most important energy states in the country?
In the back.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Rob Finn with the National Community Stabilization Trust. I'd really love to hear the panel's perspective on trying to balance out in the aftermath of events like this, the tendency, as we saw in the wake of the economic crisis, for investors and out-of-state capital to come in to the housing world, and the challenges that poses for homeownership, for the maintenance of wealth in already vulnerable communities, and any strategies that you might have perspective on in the aftermath of Katrina or in your planning backgrounds about how do we keep this from being a scenario where Wall Street preys on people who are already recovering from disaster.
And I'm going to add a question that came from the webcast. How do you recommend that private foundation funders identify the most effective organizations to support for an equitable, long view, resilient impact? And I'm going to invite you, since we have only a few minutes left, I'm going to briefly restate the questions we've heard and just pick one. So private foundation funders, who to invest in, really learning from a global perspective instead of being as myopic as the United States so often is. Advice for a local service provider on the ground with a storm approaching, I think, or a disaster approaching. The challenge about our energy infrastructure in the context of global warming. And exploitation by investors in ways that undermine the well-being of original residents or vulnerable populations. So, Marion, do you want to start? And you can have any
Sure.
one of those.
Okay, great. I will take the question about how do we best protect homeless people and serve homeless people, not just because it had an embedded compliment from my colleagues. And if any of you want to take a look at it, enterprisecommunity.org, we have tools for building owners about how to immediately deal with disasters both before and after. HUD actually rolled out a homeless toolkit in disasters about a month ago, and that's available on HUD.gov, which has tremendous resources. That's the first time HUD had created disaster-specific toolkits around serving the homeless.
Carlos?
So I pick up two strands. Maybe that'll make it even more efficient. So this issue of climate change mitigation, separate from the idea of disaster mitigation, but related, obviously. I think when I was referring to leadership before, and honest leadership, I think part of the challenge is that we have a significant climate denial in this country that's so persistent, and that's absurd. The only way you're going to be able to prepare for future disasters is to know the type of disasters that are going to occur. So thank you for upping the ante. And I think that should be the basis of any conversation we have about future disaster preparation. Noting that only some of the disasters in this country are climate related. We still have earthquakes and other terrorist attacks and other related things. So in terms of international responses, certainly, and Phil, my guess may be speaking to this a bit more, but the Netherlands, which has been dealing with water management issues for its history, certainly has developed much better senses of infrastructure and community engagement. I mean, there's the famous story of Netherlands gathering all these farmers who were flooded in the 60s and saying, we're going to have to, in certain points of the year, allow your farmlands to be completely flooded. And they agreed to it. And there was a whole conversation about how that would transition. So that's the kind of conversation that Marge was referring to in terms of relocation. For the Caribbean islands, those that aren't part of the U.S. Commonwealth or U.S. Related, I think there's hopefully a lot of Commonwealth aid that's coming in, UN, ISDR, ideally USAID funding goes to help support these. But the reality is island nations, both in the Pacific and the Caribbean, are highly vulnerable. I probably should let it go. We could talk about energy after.
We have just barely any time left, but so let me just give Koshana and Phil each a sentence or two to close.
Okay.
Or to respond.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a sentence or two.
Go for it.
I'm going to try, but I'm not going to do it. So I'm just going to be honest. So the questions about the climate change and sort of global response, my answers were really depressing. So I'm glad that Carlos did kind of handled that. But what I will say about the state level action around energy, I live in Louisiana, so no, not really hopeful at this time about sort of efforts there. Although at the city level in New Orleans, we have a mayor that is really sort of working on a plan, in accordance with the Paris agreements, and is interested in sort of setting goals around capping CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases and all that stuff. So is working on some progressive policies at the city level, and I think that's the case in some other cities across the country. Really quickly, the question about housing and sort of investors. I think what we've seen post-Katrina is really more so of, again, because of the lack of a plan, the Housing Authority ended up relinquishing quite a bit of control of the redeveloped properties that used to be public housing developments. Now they're mixed income communities, and oftentimes managed by out-of-state management companies. And so whereas the Housing Authority has been working with a coalition of housing advocates to pass some pretty progressive policies around, for instance, criminal background screenings that promote family reunification, the out-of-state developers and managers are not following those guidelines. And so we're continuing to see different policies implemented across the board. And so the folks who have to access that housing are really facing some tough times. And some of that maybe could have been ameliorated or could have been avoided if there had been a plan for the Housing Authority to maintain control over that housing. And I'm not going to say anything else.
Last word?
Okay, quick, I'll respond to the international because we have a long-term National Science Foundation sponsored research project in the Netherlands where we're comparing the Houston area to the Netherlands. It's about the same jurisdictional in size. And the Netherlands, Rotterdam, it's a working class city, big port. It's more low income, poor in the city. And they treat living with the water as an economic opportunity and to increase the vibrancy of the city. Where I stood in public participation, they'll take a plaza in the middle of a neighborhood, they'll sink it, right? Put a soccer, football, basketball, put some seats around it, make it part of the hub of the neighborhood, but it becomes a water plaza. When they have heavy rain, they recognize they can't keep the development out, but it was very engaged from the colors to the design, and this was in a low-income Muslim neighborhood. And they're repeating, that's one example, but they have underground storage and garages. They make the dikes part of the city, the green knoll, and build in, but they view it as an economic opportunity and a vibrancy.
Great. So I want to thank this terrific panel for insights that exploded out over the time that we have available, and thank all of you for coming and joining us in this conversation today.